Jaime Lannister stood in the great hall of the Red Keep, his golden hand resting against the hilt of his sword, a mild tremor of restless energy traveling through his arm. He had dressed carefully that morning in a tunic of crimson and gold, the roaring lion of House Lannister embroidered on his chest. He felt trapped within those confines, his name and his father's ambitions coiling around him like an invisible chain. The whispers that had echoed through the halls in recent days now pressed down upon him with unimaginable weight. Lord Tywin Lannister, his father, was orchestrating a new alliance to secure the safety and fortunes of both houses Lannister and Stark. A marriage alliance. Jaime, the renowned Kingslayer and heir to Casterly Rock, was to wed Sansa Stark, the eldest daughter of the late Lord Eddard Stark. As he stared across the vaulted hall, the velvet carpets swallowing the sound of every step, Jaime's gaze fell upon the silent figure of Sansa Stark. She stood to one side, a young woman on the brink of her 18th name day, her auburn hair braided neatly, her posture straight. She wore a gown of sky blue, trimmed with direwolf embroidery along the bodice, a proud reflection of her house. Her blue eyes, once so filled with girlish dreams, were now laced with apprehension. They had never been close, indeed, their paths had seldom intersected. Jaime had been occupied in the war, in the negotiations, in the complicated politics of King's Landing, whereas Sansa had been little more than a captive and pawn at court, betrothed and unbetrothed, threatened and used. He could see the uncertainty haunting her, though she strove to mask it behind a courageous front. She kept her chin raised, refusing to let her fear show. Jaime recognized that determination. It was the same steely core he had often glimpsed in his sister Cersei, though Sansa's nature was gentler, less corrupted by King's Landing's intrigues. He took a moment to reflect on how quickly the tides of power could shift. A year prior, no one in Westeros would have imagined a pact between the Starks and the Lannisters. The War of the Five Kings had raged on with savage intensity, with the Starks seeking vengeance for the injustice done to Lord Eddard Stark and the Lannisters fighting to maintain their grip on the Iron Throne through Joffrey Baratheon. But that was before the casualties mounted on all sides, before winter's icy hand closed around the realm, and before Tywin Lannister recognized that an endless war would only serve to deplete the coffers of Casterly Rock. If there was one thing Tywin Lannister despised, it was bleeding gold for a lost cause. And so, the letters had been sent, the terms negotiated. An uneasy peace and a strategic marriage would unite the two houses. The wedding would take place in the throne room itself that very afternoon. A sense of finality pressed heavily on everyone gathered. The courtiers, the knights, and the lords who had come to witness this unexpected union. The Iron Throne loomed on its dais at the far end, a monolithic presence of fused swords, promising a fragile calm in the realm should the vow be spoken. King Tommen sat upon it, the sweet-natured boy king attempting to look regal, though the weight of the crown seemed too large for his brow. His mother, Cersei, stood just behind, her green eyes sharp with disapproval. Though she masked it with a cool, practiced smile, Jaime could sense her displeasure at this union. She loathed the Starks almost as much as they despised her. Yet Tywin had commanded it, and no one, least of all Cersei, had the power to stand in his way. Jaime slowly crossed the hall, stopping a few paces from Sansa. He made a courteous bow that felt unnatural to him, the motion stiff without the easy grace that once came so effortlessly. He recalled the days when he had both hands, when swordsmanship was second nature and the world seemed simpler to him. So much had changed. Now, whenever he moved, he felt the cold weight of the gold prosthetic upon his wrist, a perpetual reminder of his capture, his maiming, and everything that had transpired since. There were days he thought he might be haunted by that stump forever. His eyes flicked over Sansa's features, taking her in. She was taller than he remembered, her face no longer that of a child. There was a certain heartbreak etched into her features that spoke of lost innocence. He wondered how she must feel about being bartered off yet again, as if her hand in marriage was no more than a strategic piece to be moved around a chessboard. She had been destined for Joffrey, then Tyrion, and now Jaime. Each betrothal, every wedding arrangement, had come loaded with its own humiliations and tragedies. Jaime felt a twinge of reluctance. He might have detested the Starks once, or at least found them uninteresting, but Sansa was not the cause of all this strife. She was little more than a victim, just as much a victim as he was of Tywin's will. He inclined his head. "My lady," he said softly, his voice betraying little emotion. Her lips parted in a polite smile, but it did not reach her eyes. "Sir Jaime," she returned. Her voice was quiet, hesitant, but behind it was a tentative strength. They stood like that, an arm's length apart, for a moment that felt like it would stretch into eternity. People were watching them, murmuring behind hands and exchanging speculative glances. One of the septas caught Jaime's attention, gesturing politely that they should approach the altar soon. Today's ceremony would be officiated by the High Septon, arranged in haste certainly, but done with all pomp that the crown could muster on such short notice. The marriage was to be recognized far and wide as the forging of a new era, a bond meant to dispel the rancor between Ice and Lion. Jaime offered Sansa his arm, and she took it reluctantly, resting her slim fingers against his stiff, embroidered sleeve. The hush fell over the crowd as they walked up the length of the hall, their footsteps echoing. The presence of the king's guard in their white cloaks was palpable, symbolizing the gravity of this event, though Jaime felt only an emptiness where excitement or joy might normally reside in a wedding. He would marry her. He would do his duty because he was a Lannister, and Lannisters always paid their debts, including the ones imposed by the Lord of Casterly Rock. Before the High Septon, with King Tommen perched on the Iron Throne behind him, they paused. The vow was simple, the arrangement all but concluded. Tywin Lannister stood to one side, his expression carved from stone. Sansa's only living relative present was her brother, Bran Stark, who had journeyed south under a careful treaty of neutrality for this solemn moment. The boy was accompanied by a small retinue loyal to House Stark, but they were heavily outnumbered by the lions in their midst. Bran's solemn gaze was hard to read. Jaime wondered what the boy truly felt about seeing his sister forced into marriage with a man who once pushed him from a tower. Of course, no one had ever proven that Jaime was responsible for Bran's fall, but Sansa may have had her suspicions, and Bran might have them too. It was an ugly undercurrent to the entire proceeding, unspoken but potent. When the High Septon asked for the bride's hand, Jaime gently turned, taking Sansa's hand in his gloved flesh one, trying not to let his golden prosthetic become an unwelcome reminder between them. She looked at him, her eyes flicking to the gold with a faint unease, but she said nothing. The words they spoke were forced, mechanical, and the hush in the hall felt oppressive. Yet, Sansa's voice rang clearly enough in the vow, and Jaime did his best to meet her eyes with sincerity, though sincerity was something he had seldom shown. The vows bound them in the light of the Seven, a vow that neither truly felt in their hearts, but one they could not escape. And then it was done. The High Septon proclaimed them man and wife. A polite applause echoed briefly among the lords and ladies assembled, uncertain and muted. Jaime leaned in and pressed a chaste kiss to Sansa's cheek. In that soft moment, he inhaled the scent of her hair, lavender and cold winter air, a contradiction that intrigued him. She turned her face aside with a flush and took a careful step back, her dignity intact. They were quickly ushered out of the throne room, a perfunctory feast to follow in the smaller hall. The entire affair was overshadowed by tension. No one quite knew how to speak of it. The Starks and Lannisters were not at war, not exactly, but this peace was so fragile that every word felt as though it could spark new hostilities. Only Tywin Lannister's formidable presence kept the uneasy lords from letting old grudges slip free in an unguarded moment. The wedding feast featured the best meats, wines, and other delicacies that King's Landing could provide under the looming threat of winter. Jaime sat at the center table beside Sansa. From the corner of his eye, he could see Cersei watching him, lips tightened, her green eyes flicking with resentment. Next to her sat King Tommen, who was trying valiantly to appear cheerful, sipping from a cup of watered wine. Marjorie Tyrell, recently wed to Tommen, occasionally passed sweet, consoling glances at Sansa, as if trying to extend some courtesy. But there was a distance there too. Houses might be allied today, but could as easily be at each other's throats tomorrow. Sansa picked at her food with disinterest, nibbling on a piece of bread. Jaime cleared his throat quietly, acutely aware that he should say something to the bride he had just claimed, but the words did not come easily. He leaned a fraction closer, speaking in a low voice meant just for her. "You barely touched your meal." She looked up, her expression polite but guarded. "I'm not very hungry," she said. Her voice was still gentle, though Jaime caught a note of firm self-possession behind it. It reminded him that she was not a child anymore. His lips curved a little, neither exactly a smile nor a frown. "I won't take offense," he murmured. "Feasts aren't to everyone's taste, especially under these circumstances." She took a small sip from her cup, which was filled with watered wine. She looked out at the assembled lords, the flickering torchlight catching the slight shimmer of tears in her eyes that she fought to keep at bay. "It's all so strange," she whispered. He took a moment to study her profile, the smooth curve of her jaw, the tension in her shoulders, the slight quiver in her lashes when she blinked. He found himself thinking that Sansa Stark carried herself with more dignity than most highborn ladies thrice her age, having endured the horrors of losing her father, her home, and her illusions so young. Jaime let a pause linger before speaking again. "Strange for me too," he said, surprising himself with the admission. "I never expected to be in this position." She let her gaze slide over him, eyes traveling to his golden hand. He noticed her glance at it, and he resisted the reflex to hide it beneath the table. "My Lord Father used to say that some men's fates were woven with very tangled thread," she said softly, as though recalling a fond memory. "I never understood exactly what he meant, but now I think I do. So many threads in Westeros. They wrap around us, binding us whether we wish it or not." Jaime felt an odd mix of regret and understanding at her words. He offered her the faintest of nods, then turned to watch the dancers who had begun to fill the cleared space at the center of the hall. The music was lively, though forced, as though the pipers and drummers sought to drown out the tension with noise. Laughter rang here and there, but it was brittle. Now and again, he caught the hush as someone cast a furtive glance in their direction. The Kingslayer and his Stark bride. When the meal ended, the formalities resumed. The time had come for the bedding ceremony, an ancient tradition that both of them seemed to dread, though neither admitted it aloud. The courtiers looked on with gleeful malice or lascivious interest, for it was the custom in Westeros to carry the bride and groom to their chamber in a riotous procession, stripping away the garments bit by bit while bawdy jokes and songs filled the air. Sansa, cheeks flaming, stood stiffly as a group of ladies in waiting surrounded her, while Jaime was assailed by drunken knights and lords who sought to hoist him up and strip him. Jaime offered a curt protest, but tradition was tradition. He had once relished such rowdiness, back when he was young and arrogant, thinking the world owed him everything. Now it felt hollow and humiliating to be paraded like a prize. Still, he put on a sardonic smile and endured it. When the chaos ended, he and Sansa were deposited at the threshold of the bedchamber that had been prepared for them, both red-faced, Jaime wearing only a loose shirt and breeches, Sansa wrapped in nothing but a light shift that left her arms and shoulders exposed. The drunken throng shouted vulgar encouragement, then slammed the door shut. Alone in the dim chamber, they were faced with the bed, strewn with fresh linens and rose petals, meant to symbolize fertility or some other well-worn tradition. 2 tall candles flickered on a nearby table. The hush was excruciating. Sansa clutched the front of her shift, eyes lowered, her body trembling very slightly in the candlelight. Jaime stood a few paces away, unsure of what to do with himself. He had never felt so uncertain or uneasy around a woman. He cleared his throat. He started, then stopped, feeling foolish. Cersei had been the only woman he'd lain with willingly and intimately. This was a different kind of arrangement, burdened with fear and shame, neither of which appealed to him. He took a slow breath, stepping closer to Sansa, but with caution, as if approaching a skittish horse. "We do not have to do anything tonight," he said, speaking quietly. "No one can force us." Sansa lifted her gaze, and in that moment, He saw profound relief flooding her eyes, gratitude that he would even consider such a mercy. "Thank you," she breathed, and her voice came out so soft, so earnest, that it tugged at Jaime's chest. She paused, swallowing. "I know it's expected, but I can't, not tonight." Her eyes spoke volumes of everything she had endured at Joffrey's hands, at the uncertainty and fear coursing through her now. Jaime took another step closer, very gently reaching out to rest his flesh hand on her arm. She was trembling. "I understand," he said, and he realized with some surprise that he did. Part of him felt an odd sense of responsibility to protect her, now that they were bound. A vow was a vow, and though Jaime Lannister had once broken vows, he was not heartless, especially not toward this girl who had lost so much. She gave him a timid smile, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. He moved past her and took one of the spare blankets from the trunk at the foot of the bed. He spread it on the floor, far enough away from the bed to give her space, but close enough that he could keep watch. "You can have the bed," he offered. "I'll sleep on the floor." Her expression was a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "But, my lord, your arm, you should be comfortable." He gestured dismissively with his golden hand, though the weight of it felt more pronounced than usual. "I'm better off than many. Take the bed. You're the lady of the room now." Her eyes flicked over him, and he thought he saw something gentle, maybe even compassionate, in her gaze. It was not the pity or scorn he was used to seeing in King's Landing. "Thank you," she said again. Then, stepping lightly, she moved to the bed, drew the covers aside, and slipped beneath them with remarkable quiet. Jaime lowered himself to the blanket he'd laid out, propping his back against the wall. He closed his eyes, the flicker of the candles turning red behind his lids. He listened to the rustle of Sansa's movements as she turned on the bed, presumably seeking some position of comfort. After a moment, he heard her speak again, her voice tentative. "Sir Jaime, do you think this arrangement will truly bring peace?" He opened his eyes, regarding the shadows that curled along the ceiling. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Perhaps it will for a time. My father is a relentless negotiator. If he has what he wants, he might leave your family alone." She exhaled softly, her voice all but swallowed by the night. "And if he doesn't?" Jaime was silent for a moment. "Then we do what we must. But let us hope it doesn't come to that." He heard her shift again, presumably settling into a wary slumber. Jaime let his head rest against the wall, the stone cool against his scalp. Through the narrow window, a sliver of moonlight cut across the floor, illuminating the golden lion sigil on his discarded tunic. He wondered if he would ever truly escape the shadow of Tywin Lannister, or the stigma of his own reputation. He wondered if, for all the vows and alliances and forced smiles, anything in this cursed realm would ever truly heal. Eventually, tiredness claimed him. He drifted off to uneasy dreams, haunted by flickering visions of 1,000 regrets and uncertain tomorrows. In the dawn's pale light, Jaime woke with a tightness in his back from sleeping on the floor. He pushed himself up, rotating his shoulders to ease the stiffness. Sansa was still asleep atop the bed, curled on her side, her auburn hair spilling across the pillow. For a moment he stood silently, gazing at her. There was something achingly fragile about her, and yet he sensed a quiet resilience beneath that surface. He retrieved his clothes, dressing quickly, buckling his sword belt around his waist out of habit. No matter that he would only be walking around the Red Keep, he had long since learned never to let go of a weapon in such a place. With a last glance at Sansa, he stepped out into the corridor, leaving the hush of the wedding chamber behind. Outside, the castle was stirring to life. Servants bustled about, knights changed shifts, and the corridors echoed with footsteps. Jaime walked with purpose, though he was not entirely certain where he was heading. The morning air was chill, carrying the damp scent of the sea. He found his feet leading him out into the courtyard, to a quieter corner near the stables, where the clang of swords could sometimes be heard. There, he encountered Brienne of Tarth, her tall, broad-shouldered figure unmistakable. She wore a simple tunic and breeches, a practiced sword in hand, going through the motions of a sword drill. Jaime paused, his golden hand flexing reflexively. He and Brienne shared a bond born of mutual adversity and reluctant respect. She turned when she noticed him, inclining her head. "Sir Jaime," she greeted, though she did not sheath her practiced sword. He gave her a nod. "Brienne," he replied, avoiding calling her wench out of the hard-earned courtesy he'd developed for her. "You're up early." She shrugged, a small gesture for someone of her stature. "I find it helps keep my mind clear," she said. Her eyes flicked to his, then away, as if she was uncertain how to address the new reality of his marriage. "I trust your wedding night went as you wished?" Jaime let out a humorless chuckle, glancing at the stable wall. "As well as it could," he said. "Nobody ended the night dead or screaming, so I suppose that's a success in King's Landing." Brienne pursed her lips, glancing at him as though weighing whether to offer condolences or criticism. "She is a gentle soul," she said. "Lady Sansa has suffered much. I hope you won't add to her burdens." Jaime bristled slightly at the implication, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I have no intention of harming her," he said quietly. "I gave my word, Brienne." Brienne studied him for a moment, perhaps recalling how he had shown her unexpected kindness or loyalty. She gave him a curt nod. "Your word is worth something," she said gruffly, "though not everyone would agree. Keep it, Jaime. You owe Lady Stark that much." He did not argue. He watched Brienne resume her drills, the clash of her practice sword against the wooden post echoing across the yard. Then he made his way back inside. He felt ill at ease, as though wearing clothes that didn't fit. The entire keep seemed abuzz with talk of the new alliance. Everywhere he turned, servants and courtiers cast glances at him, all filled with speculation or sly curiosity. By mid-morning, he found himself summoned to his father's solar. With a resigned sigh, Jaime climbed the winding staircase, ignoring the twinge in his wrist where the gold hand attached. Tywin Lannister's summons rarely promised a pleasant conversation. In fact, Jaime could hardly recall a time in his youth when he had come away from his father's presence unscathed by criticism. In the solar, Tywin sat behind a massive table stacked with parchments, flanked by the Lannister crimson banners. He barely acknowledged Jaime's arrival, scribbling something with a quill before blotting it. Then, without looking up, he said, "Close the door." Jaime obeyed, feeling a tingle of apprehension slither down his spine. He stepped forward, waiting for Tywin to speak. After a moment, his father set the quill down and finally lifted his gaze, cool and sharp. "You have done your duty," Tywin said. "The alliance with the Starks is sealed, and we have secured a vital piece in the North's loyalty. That should bring us a measure of stability." Jaime said nothing, though he noticed Tywin's measured tone. His father was a master at hiding his true intentions, layering words with meaning that only emerged when he was ready. "But be aware," Tywin continued, "that this marriage, while beneficial, is not the end of the matter. You will remain in King's Landing with your new wife for the immediate future. I expect you to conduct yourself with honor, or at least enough appearance of it that the realm remains placated." He paused. "I have heard that you did not consummate the marriage last night." A prickle of anger shot through Jaime. He wondered which toady had rushed to report that piece of personal information. "I didn't think it was any of your concern," he said, his tone clipped. Tywin's expression hardened. "Everything in this alliance is my concern, Jaime. The union must be recognized as valid. A child will secure the bond between our houses beyond question. Or have you forgotten how alliances truly hold?" Jaime suppressed a groan. The thought of fathering a child with Sansa, someone he barely knew, who was frightened and forced into this union, sat uneasily with him. He remembered how her face looked last night, pale and fearful in the candlelight. "We're married," he muttered. "That is enough for now. I won't force her." Tywin's lips thinned. "I did not say force her. I said fulfill your duty." He inhaled slowly. "If you don't wish to see everything unravel, You will find a way to make her your wife in truth, sooner rather than later. Do I make myself clear? Jaime set his jaw. Crystal, father. Tywin's gaze lingered on him, assessing. This war has cost us dearly. Lady Sansa is young, impressionable. You need only treat her with courtesy and let nature take its course. It will serve our house, and it will spare her further suffering. Jaime wanted to laugh at the bitter irony of Tywin speaking about sparing suffering, but he swallowed the urge. Instead, he inclined his head stiffly. He turned to go, but Tywin spoke again. Jaime, he said more quietly. Jaime paused. You've always been capable of great things, Tywin said. If you would only stop squandering your potential, this marriage can be an opportunity to build a legacy, not just for House Lannister, but for yourself. Don't forget that. Jaime did not trust himself to answer without sarcasm or anger. He simply nodded and left the room, letting the door close behind him. For the next few days, Jaime felt trapped in King's Landing more than ever. He and Sansa took their meals together, attended to certain court appearances as was expected of them, and performed all the public gestures that signaled a union of two great houses. The court's eyes never left them, always prying, always whispering. Sansa bore it stoically, her chin held high, though Jaime could see the tension in her shoulders each time someone mentioned her father's name or inquired after her family. He did his best to offer small kindnesses, standing between her and leering courtiers, gently coaxing her to eat when she picked at her meals, and occasionally offering a half-sincere compliment to ease the gloom. He was no poet or gallant knight. He had long since lost that naive sense of chivalry. But he found himself wanting to shield her from the cruelty of King's Landing nonetheless. Perhaps it was the memory of her battered innocence, or maybe it was his old regret festering somewhere within. Some nights, he lay on the floor while she slept in the bed, though sometimes she would insist he take the bed and she would sleep on the chaise near the window. They danced around each other in a strange pattern of guarded politeness. They spoke of inconsequential things, the weather, the changes in the castle staff, idle gossip about which lord was rumored to be conspiring with which faction. Neither of them had the courage to ask the deeper questions. But every night, Jaime remembered Tywin's looming demand, that the marriage be consummated, that they produce an heir. The mere thought of it twisted his insides with a complicated knot of shame, duty, and reluctant desire. Once or twice, while Sansa read quietly before bed, Jaime allowed his gaze to linger on her. He recognized that she was comely, her features delicate, her hair a shimmering auburn that caught the lamplight. He realized that if the circumstances had been different, if they had met under more forgiving stars, she might have easily captivated him. But as it was, he could not see past the mountain of grudges, the tragedies that had befallen her family at the hands of his. He also found his mind drifting to Cersei, recalling their shared secrets, the intensity that had once burned between them, now withered by betrayal, disillusion, and the knowledge that their union was a sin that had come to cost them more than it had ever given. He could not go back to her. Not now. The only path lay forward. On one such night, Sansa looked up from her reading, noticing his gaze upon her. She flushed slightly. He offered a faint smile. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice breaking the long silence. She hesitated, glancing at the leather-bound book in her lap. "It's a collection of stories about the 7 heroes," she said. "Tales of gallant knights and wise kings. My mother used to read them to me when I was little." Jaime nodded, shifting his weight. "Do you find comfort in them?" She closed the book gently, running her fingers over the worn cover. "Sometimes," she admitted. "They remind me of home, of simpler times." Her expression grew wistful. "But they also make me sad, because those stories feel so far from reality." A pang of something like regret rippled through Jaime. "Stories can do that," he said softly. He reached up, instinctively moving to rub his face with his right hand, forgetting for a moment that it was the golden one. He sighed. "I once believed I could be a gallant knight," he said, surprising himself with the admission. "But the truth is rarely that simple. We're all forced to do things we'd rather not do." For duty or for survival? She looked at him then, truly looked as though trying to peer behind his cool facade. "You saved me once," she said, her voice quiet. "Back when I was under Joffrey's cruelty. You stepped in. I remember." He blinked, trying to recall. It must have been a fleeting moment, perhaps when Joffrey had been tormenting her in the courtyard or threatening to force her to look upon her father's head. Jaime remembered feeling disgust for Joffrey's sadism, but that was overshadowed by so many other events. "If I did," he said, "I suppose it was the least I could do." She studied him, her eyes softening. "I want to believe," she murmured, "that not all of the Lannisters are cruel, that there is some good in you, in Tyrion as well. He tried to protect me in his way." Jaime nodded. He remembered Tyrion's forced marriage to Sansa. It had been a different brand of tragedy, one that ironically bonded them now. "My brother is a good man," he said, though sorrow touched his voice. "Wherever he is now, I suspect he's better off than in this viper's nest." He paused, unsure how far he could trust Sansa with his own regrets regarding Tyrion's disappearance and the chaos left in his wake. She lowered her gaze, perhaps recalling the short period she was wed to Tyrion, the kindness he had shown her in refusing to consummate that forced marriage. Finally, she turned her gaze back to her book, and the conversation subsided into an uneasy hush. They were two strangers bound by a vow that neither had chosen. It would take time, if it were even possible, to bridge that gap. After a fortnight, invitations arrived from Casterly Rock. Tywin had decided to host a grand feast there, to publicly present Jaime and Sansa as husband and wife to the Western Lords. The intention was to demonstrate the solidity of the alliance, to quell any rumors of a sham union, and to remind the realm that House Lannister was still strong. The prospect of leaving King's Landing for the Rock unsettled Sansa, though she tried to hide it. Jaime noticed how her hands trembled when she read the missive. "Must we go?" she asked, setting the parchment down carefully. Jaime took a moment to consider his response. He knew Tywin would not permit them to stay away. This was all part of the grand design to unify the houses. "It's not a request," he said gently. "My father wants to show you off to the Western Lords, and to show me off as well, now that I'm his obedient son." The bitterness in his tone was evident. "I'm afraid we have no choice." Sansa's lips parted in a resigned sigh. "Then we must go," she said. They left King's Landing under heavy guard, traveling in a wheelhouse for Sansa's comfort, though Jaime often rode alongside on horseback. The road west was long and dusty, but dotted with changing landscapes that slowly gave way to the rolling hills near the Westerlands. Along the way, Jaime made efforts to treat Sansa with courtesy. He gifted her small tokens: a carved wooden direwolf from a roadside craftsman, a bunch of wildflowers plucked by the roadside, things that might lighten her mood or make her feel less a prisoner. She accepted them with a shy smile, as though uncertain what to make of his attentions. They spent nights in various castles or well-guarded inns. Rumors traveled with them. Talk of strange sightings beyond the wall, rumors that White Walkers walked again, and that the Night's Watch was calling for aid. Sansa seemed distressed by these rumors, no doubt fearful for her family and her home in the north. Jaime listened, but he was never sure what to say. He had never believed in White Walkers or the old stories, but too many strange things were happening in the world to dismiss them outright. At last, after many days, the spires of Casterly Rock loomed before them, carved into the imposing mass of stone that jutted from the coastline. The sea roared at its base, waves crashing against the cliffs. Above, the banners of the Golden Lion flew proudly. Sansa gazed upon it with wide eyes as their retinue wound its way up the steep road to the main gates. Jaime felt a stir of conflicting emotions. This was his home, in theory, yet he had spent so little time here. They were greeted by the Lannister household guard and ushered into the keep. Servants scurried to carry in their belongings. Sansa was shown to a comfortable chamber overlooking the sea, a vantage that might have been pleasant under other circumstances. Jaime noted how she lingered by the window, drawn to the expanse of the ocean. He left her to settle in, knowing the next days would be full of ceremony. True to Tywin's intent, A lavish feast was prepared that evening to welcome them. The great hall of Casterly Rock was adorned with torches and banners, the flicker of light dancing across the pillars and tapestries. Lords and ladies of the Westerlands gathered, eager to see the legendary Kingslayer and his new bride. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted boar, fresh bread, and exotic spices from lands beyond the sea. Sansa sat beside Jaime at the high table, her expression poised but reserved. She responded politely to the curious conversation of minor lords who came to pay respects. Lady Lefford, an older woman with silver hair, asked Sansa about her experiences in the north and at King's Landing. Sansa answered with polite courtesy, though her words were guarded. Jaime watched the interplay, noticing how many of these lords eyed Sansa with suspicion or curiosity. She was a Stark, after all. He supposed they wondered if she was some savage northerner or a frightened girl they could manipulate. He felt a surge of protectiveness, tamping down the flash of annoyance. Eventually, Tywin rose to speak a few words about the Union, extolling the strength of House Lannister and the unity brought by Lady Sansa's presence. Polite applause rippled around the room, though it was far from thunderous. The Westerlands lords knew the cost of the war and were wary of alliances. Still, for Tywin's sake, they pretended. After the speeches and toasts, some of the hall erupted into dance. Musicians played ballads. Courtiers engaged in gossip and flirtation. Jaime, feeling restless, excused himself from the high table and made his way to the outer courtyard. It was a crisp evening, the sky streaked with moonlight. The sea wind carried the tang of salt, reminding him that he was indeed back at the rock. He found a quiet spot near a stone railing overlooking the water below. For a time, he simply listened to the crash of waves. Then he heard footsteps behind him, soft and hesitant. He turned to see Sansa. She had followed him, still wearing the elegant gown of dark blue velvet with silver direwolf trim at the sleeves. Her auburn hair was gathered into an elaborate arrangement. He offered a slight nod. "Couldn't stomach the revelry?" he asked lightly. She shook her head, stepping to the railing and gazing over the edge. "It's all too much," she said, her voice barely above the wind. "All those people I don't know, all those faces watching me. I needed some air." He understood. King's Landing might have been cruel, but at least Sansa had grown somewhat used to it. This was an entirely new crowd, though no less judgmental or dangerous in its own way. "You're braver than you think," he said quietly. "I've known knights who would cower in your position." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "I don't feel brave. Sometimes I feel like a leaf in a storm, being blown from one place to another." Her gaze flicked to him. "Why did you come out here?" He shrugged, the golden hand resting on the stone. "I needed a moment, too. Casterly Rock." He turned his gaze back to the fortress behind them. "It doesn't feel like home as much as I once imagined." She studied him silently. "Is anywhere home for you?" The question caught him off guard. He frowned, turning it over. He thought of King's Landing, with its filth and intrigue, thought of Harrenhal, of Riverrun, of all the places he had traveled as a warrior. None felt like home. He exhaled. "It used to be wherever I could be myself," he said softly. "I'm not sure that place exists anymore." She nodded as though she understood. The wind lifted a few strands of her hair, and she tucked them behind her ear. A quiet tension hung between them, filled with the unspoken knowledge that they were bound together now. "I know we must one day consummate this marriage," Sansa said, so quietly he almost missed it. His chest tightened. She kept her gaze on the dark horizon. "I know that's what your father expects. I know that's what the lords and ladies whisper about. They want proof of the union." He felt a wash of conflicting emotions. Guilt, responsibility, the faint stirrings of desire overshadowed by reluctance. "We don't have to rush," he said gently. "Not because my father commands it or because the realm expects it. If it happens, it should be of our own accord, not forced." She turned her head to look at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. He could sense the fear in her, but also a vulnerability, a willingness to try to trust him. "Thank you," she whispered. She lowered her gaze. I keep waiting for the blow to fall, for all the talk of courtesy to vanish. I've lived so long under the threat of cruelty, I've nearly forgotten what kindness feels like. Jaime hesitated, then reached out his flesh hand, lightly touching her shoulder. I can't promise you happiness, he said, his voice gruff, but I promise not to hurt you. She lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze. Something shifted in that moment, an unspoken understanding. She gave the barest nod. He withdrew his hand, feeling how easily the moment could tip from gentle caution into something else. They remained side by side for a while longer, listening to the roar of the sea below. Then, wordlessly, they turned back toward the hall, returning to the feast with a shared sense of reluctant resolve. In the days that followed, Tywin pressed them to attend gatherings, speak with the lords of the Westerlands, and present a unified front. Sansa bore it as well as she could, answering polite questions, avoiding traps, and carefully sidestepping any direct mention of the tragedies that had befallen her kin. Jaime found it exhausting to maintain the facade of gracious host, but he persevered. On the third day, Tywin summoned them both to his private audience chamber. They arrived to find him seated, reading a scroll. His expression was set in its usual grim lines. He motioned for them to sit. Sansa seated herself carefully, Jaime to her left. I have received a raven from the north, Tywin announced, looking at them both. House Stark's hold in Winterfell has been challenged by roving bands of Ironborn raiders near the coast, and by certain northern houses that still question the leadership in the aftermath of the war. There is also talk of savage creatures in the night, wolves, maybe worse. Young Bran Stark remains the official heir, but he is a boy and... Sansa's face turned pale. My brother. Where is he? Tywin set down the scroll. He left King's Landing shortly after the wedding, traveling under the protection of a small retinue. Reports indicate he took a circuitous route to avoid danger, but we've had no official word of his arrival in Winterfell. It is possible he has delayed or been forced to divert his path. Sansa's hands tightened in her lap. We must help him, she said, voice urgent. He's only a boy. Tywin's gaze was inscrutable. The North is not my primary concern, except insofar as it concerns this alliance. However, I have considered dispatching a contingent of soldiers to ensure that Bran Stark can safely reclaim his seat, thus securing the region's loyalty. But for this to be seen as legitimate, it might be best if a Stark, fully recognized as part of this house, returns to Winterfell alongside our forces to quell any rebellion and restore order. Jaime tensed. He could see where this was leading. Tywin continued smoothly. Which means you, Lady Sansa, as the Lady of Winterfell by birth and by your new alliance to House Lannister, could serve as a unifying figure. The Northerners may rally to you, or at least be more inclined to stand down if you arrive with the King's blessing and with Lannister support. It would be wise for Ser Jaime to accompany you. Sansa's breath caught. The prospect of returning to Winterfell, the home she had lost, must have seemed at once a wondrous and terrifying idea. She flicked her gaze to Jaime. But what of your father's plans here at Casterly Rock? She asked. Tywin's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he disliked being questioned. This is my plan, Lady Sansa. Nothing would better cement our newly forged alliance than House Lannister aiding the Starks in retaking full control of the North. Once your brother is secure in Winterfell, he can swear formal allegiance to the throne, and the realm will have fewer reasons to doubt this marriage. Jaime finally spoke, his tone clipped. And if the North refuses to accept our help? Tywin's lips curved in a thin smile. Then we will ensure they do, one way or another. Sansa looked distressed. Jaime felt the pull of conflicting loyalties within him. On the one hand, he was a Lannister, expected to carry out Tywin's directives. On the other, he knew Sansa yearned for her home, and he did not wish to see her people subjugated by force. We'll do what we must, he said at last, glancing at Sansa apologetically. Tywin inclined his head in approval. Good. I'll have the preparations made. You will leave within the fortnight, once the necessary troops and supplies are gathered. The meeting ended, leaving Jaime and Sansa to walk down the corridors in troubled silence. Only when they reached the courtyard did Jaime speak. "If we go north," he said, "it won't be a simple journey. Winter is near, and the roads will be harsh." Sansa turned her wide eyes on him, swallowing hard. "I know," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "But if it means protecting my brother, if it means I can see Winterfell again, I'll endure whatever I must." He admired her courage, though it reminded him of all that lay before them. The uncertain terrain of the north, the skeptical eyes of the northerners, the old wounds that had not yet healed between Lannister and Stark. "Then we'll do it," he said, placing his golden hand gently on her forearm. "We'll make sure he's safe." She nodded, though her gaze was distant, perhaps imagining the cold winds of the north and the home she had lost. Neither of them knew what awaited them there, whether it would be open arms or raised spears. But for better or worse, they were bound, and the road ahead would force them to rely on each other in ways neither had expected. Over the next days, wagons of supplies were loaded with food, blankets, and weapons. A contingent of Lannister men-at-arms was chosen, many of them seasoned veterans of the war. Jaime spent hours inspecting the troops, verifying their readiness for the cold, silently hoping this would not turn into a bloodbath should the northern houses resist. Sansa busied herself with gathering personal effects, warm garments, and any letters or documents that might help persuade the northern lords of her rightful claim. Sometimes they walked the halls of Casterly Rock together, drawing curious stares from those who saw them. The Kingslayer and the Stark girl side by side. There were whispers that the marriage might actually be more than a forced bond. Others scoffed, believing it was all a ruse. Jaime paid little mind to the gossip, though he noticed the subtle shift in Sansa's posture when she was at his side. She held herself more firmly, as though drawing some measure of resolve from his presence, uncertain as it was. On the eve of their departure, a small farewell feast was held. Tywin was absent, absorbed in his duties, delegating the host's role to Kevan Lannister. The meal was subdued. Many lords and ladies had already departed, not wishing to travel in the gloom of approaching winter. Sansa ate sparingly, her mind seemingly elsewhere. Jaime made an effort to keep the conversation polite, but soon gave up, letting the evening pass without fanfare. That night, they returned to their shared chamber, the one overlooking the sea. Jaime set aside his sword belt and sank into a chair by the hearth, gazing into the low flames. Sansa lingered near the bed, her hands folded before her. "We leave tomorrow," she said softly. He nodded, rubbing his stump absently. "Yes." She glanced at him, then moved closer. There was a tension in her bearing, an air of determination. "Jaime," she said quietly, using his name without a title, which she rarely did. "Before we go, she hesitated, cheeks flushing. "I want to speak honestly with you." He lifted his gaze to hers, surprised. "Go on." She took a breath, her slender fingers twisting in the fabric of her skirt. "I don't know what will happen once we reach the north. The houses may accept me or they may not. They might see you as an enemy." She swallowed. "I know that your father wants an heir from us, but I would prefer that we—" She trailed off, reddening. He rose from the chair slowly, crossing the short distance until he stood before her. He could see the flicker of the firelight in her eyes, the fine trembling of her lips. "I won't force you," he said gently. "Not now, not ever." She nodded, grateful, but she pressed on, her voice soft. "I know. You've shown me kindness. I think I should give you something in return. A sign of trust so that maybe—" Her voice faltered, and she took a step closer, so close that he could feel the heat of her body. She lifted her face to his, hesitantly, and before he could speak, she leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a tentative kiss. He froze for an instant, the warmth of her lips and the unexpected softness making his heart lurch in his chest. Then he returned the kiss, gently, uncertain how far she intended to go. His golden hand hovered at her waist, while his flesh hand rose to cup her cheek. She trembled under his touch, and he felt the racing of his own pulse. The kiss broke, leaving them both breathless. She met his gaze, eyes shining with a mix of fear and resolve. "I'm not ready for more," she whispered, "but I wanted you to know that I don't hate you." Emotion swelled in Jaime's throat, surprising him with its intensity. He thought of everything: the scorn of the realm, the weight of his father's expectations, his shattered dreams of knighthood, and the complicated ties that bound him to this girl. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice rough. She nodded, stepping back. The moment felt fragile, like spun glass. They parted ways without another word. She moving to the bed, he returning to his chair. But now there was a different tension in the air. Not purely fear or resentment, but something uncertain and raw. All through the night, while the wind howled beyond the thick walls, they lay awake in their separate spaces, each lost in thoughts of the road that stretched before them. The dawn would bring new challenges and possibly new hope. When morning came, they departed Casterly Rock at the head of a small column of soldiers. Sansa rode in a carriage for the first portion of the journey, but later, she chose to ride on horseback beside Jaime, wanting to appear strong and capable before the men. She wore a heavy fur-lined cloak to ward off the chill, the stark direwolf emblazoned on the back. Jaime wore his customary Lannister red cloak, though he felt a twinge of irony to see the lion riding beside the wolf. Their journey took them through the Westerlands, then toward the Riverlands, where the signs of the war's devastation remained. Burned farms, ruined villages, ragged refugees. Sansa's eyes were filled with sorrow at the sight. Jaime felt a familiar pang of guilt, recalling how House Lannister's armies had swept across these lands. Still, they pressed on, giving what aid they could, though they had little to spare. In time, they crossed the neck, the damp marshes making travel slow. The air grew colder with each passing league. The men joked uneasily about the approach of winter, but Jaime sensed their nerves. The north was an unknown land to many of them, and the rumors of dark omens abounded. Sansa grew quieter the closer they came to the lands of her birth, as though she feared what she might find. Eventually, the towering silhouette of Moat Cailin came into view, battered by war but still imposing. It marked the entry to the north. Beyond it lay the vast, rugged expanse that was once firmly under Stark rule. Jaime signaled the column to halt at a safe distance, studying the old fortress. He could see that a handful of northern bannermen still held the walls. Their banners flew in the icy wind. "We'll need to parley," Jaime muttered to Sansa, who had reined in her horse beside his. "We can't just storm in." She nodded, though she looked pale. "Let me speak for us. They might listen to me if they remember me at all." She swallowed, summoning her courage. Jaime admired her resolve. He signaled a small group of riders to accompany them under a white flag of truce. They approached the fortress slowly, the mud and standing water making the horses' footing treacherous. When they were within shouting distance of the gate, Jaime raised his flesh hand. "We come in peace," he called, "under the banner of House Stark and House Lannister." There was a tense pause. Then a figure appeared atop the rampart, half hidden by a battered crenellation. "Who leads you?" came the shouted reply. Sansa nudged her horse forward, her hood thrown back to reveal her face and her auburn hair. "I am Sansa Stark," she called, her voice steadier than one might expect. "Daughter of Eddard Stark, your former lord of Winterfell. I have come to reclaim my home and to find my brother, Bran Stark." Whispers and exclamations echoed above. Jaime watched the northern guards lean over the battlements, craning to see. After a moment, someone barked an order, and the gate creaked open slightly. A small group of men, carrying spears and clad in furs, stepped out onto the causeway. Their leader, a weathered man with a patchy beard, eyed Sansa warily, then flicked his gaze to Jaime. "If you are truly Sansa Stark," the man said, "prove it. We've had enough trickery from southern folk these past years." Sansa took a breath, then told him details of Winterfell, things only a true daughter of the North would know. She spoke of the hot springs, the weirwood tree in the Godswood, and recounted personal memories of her father and mother. Gradually, the tension in the man's stance eased. He glanced at his fellows, then inclined his head. "Then it seems you are who you say, but you travel with Lannisters." Jaime stiffened, but Sansa was quick to reply, explaining the alliance. She left out the more distasteful details but spoke of a truce, of House Lannister's willingness to help restore order in the north. The men exchanged doubtful glances. At last, their leader sighed. "We'll allow you to pass. But if you bring trouble north of here, you'll have all the loyal men of the north to face." Sansa nodded, relief flickering across her features. Jaime simply kept his gaze level, feeling the burden of centuries of rivalry between their houses. They guided their column through Moat Cailin, noticing how battered the defenses were from previous skirmishes. The men of the north watched them pass with cold, wary eyes, but did not bar their way. Once beyond, the road stretched northward. Sansa let out a long breath. Jaime reached over to squeeze her hand lightly, a small gesture of reassurance. When night fell, they made camp in the shadow of tall pines. Snow flurries swirled in the air, clinging to the horses' manes and the soldiers' cloaks. Sansa stood by the campfire, arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Jaime approached, passing her a cup of hot broth. She accepted it with thanks, sipping slowly. She peered into the darkness, as though trying to see beyond the trees to the ghosts of her memories. "We're in the north," she murmured. "I never thought I'd see it again." Jaime nodded. "We'll find your brother," he said. "We'll make sure he's safe." She turned her eyes on him, bright with emotion. "Thank you," she said, and though the words were simple, the depth of feeling behind them ran deep. In that moment, Jaime realized how far they had come from the day of their wedding in King's Landing. No longer strangers, they were partners in a shared cause, however tenuous. The north was vast and dangerous, winter's chill biting deeper every day. But together, the lion and the wolf were determined to restore what had been lost, and perhaps, in so doing, find the path to a fragile sort of peace. Not just for the realm, but for themselves. They stood there at the edge of the camp, the firelight dancing on their cloaks, snow drifting from the sky in slow, silent swirls. In that hush, with the howling wind their only witness, they allowed themselves to hope.